This chapter and next week's chapter are really important ones for this whole transition that takes place from the Jesus of history to the first formulations of the Christ of faith. I'm gonna go over to share the screen and get with the PowerPoint and talk for a little bit, and then we'll have a conversation. So here we go, gang. So I've really been looking forward to talking about chapter 2, Jesus as the turning point of history, and I hope you found that. I hope you found the chapter to be helpful, and I'm looking forward. And I'm hoping you're finding the my presentation to be helpful too. If we had the time, I'd love to talk to you about the black and white woodcuts, especially the woodcut that Pelican includes in the chapter. It's the most important work in the entire history of filmmaking, really. Albert Doerr's Apocalypse. It's a series of 15 woodcuts and a title page published in 1498. The one Pelican includes, as you know, is the vision of the seven candlesticks. Approaching the sesquimillennium, the year 1500, apocalyptic fears were rampant among Christian Europe, as well as the Ottoman Turks were poised on the border of Hungary, readying themselves to invade Europe, which they did in the decades following 1500, but the forces of Suleiman the Magnificent were turned back in Vienna in 1529. This was part of the heart of my doctoral work. So this is right at that time when Dürer is making these woodcuts. Dürer's Apocalypse had an overwhelming impact on the understanding of the apocalypse in all media: painting, print, drawing, sculpture, stained glass, tapestries, throughout all of Europe and to America, even to our day. He revolutionized the art of woodcut, joining together Italian Renaissance perspective in figures, landscape panorama, and three-dimensional modeling. He interprets John's poetic vision in Revelation of the end times by giving them a realistic physicality. He's sort of a Renaissance Stanley Kubrick. He makes John's vision concrete and believable. And for the people in those times, right, many illiterate, but susceptible to imagery. The landscapes are European, and except for heavenly beings, the figures are in contemporary dress. Other details, plants, animals, other objects, are accurate to the time. Remember, there's this great apocalyptic feeling of the end of the world, with the Ottoman Turks banging on the doors of Europe and approaching the year 1500, the sesquimillennium. And his tools and technique were such that he was able to create much finer lines than previous woodcut artists, making possible greater precision in details in the figures and objects. In the vision of the seven candlesticks that you have in your book, and it's on the right-hand side of the screen here, every candelabrum is different, mimicking the work of goldsmiths in Dürer's Nuremberg and Augsburg. The angel tells St. John to ingest the book, and Dürer's Apocalypse shows St. John actually cramming the pages into his mouth. The fourth writer of the Apocalypse is no longer a childlike fantasy of a smiling skeleton, as in earlier Bible woodcuts, but a perfectly believable, emaciated man. And of course, you know that I had to refer to St. Michael, the greatest figure of the New Testament next to Jesus, of course, and the greatest of all the angels. St. Michael fights the evil dragon in the air. He's suspended, his body is bent, ready to thrust his spear, and his expression is intense with effort, his hands, knees, and feet projected to the viewer. So these woodcuts, like I say, really impact and shape our views even to our present day. And it's probably, they say, I'm not an artist, but they say it's the most important work in the entire history of printmaking. Doors, woodcuts of the apocalypse. So I was glad that Pelican included it in his chapter. So now I want to talk about this Jesus of history and Christ of faith at least one more time. If you take a look at the bottom of the screen, we have the Jesus of history, and we don't know much about his life. But now trace your finger up the screen, unless you have a touch screen. But trace your finger. These are all the filters through which we have come to know this Jesus of history. That is, filters that shape our view at the top of the page, our view of who Jesus is. So how have each one of these shaped our view? Paul, the oral tradition, and I sent you the early Christian hymns, liturgies, and creeds. Paul's view of Jesus, the Gospels, look at the Gospels are already third on the list. They're already the Christ of faith. And yet we read them, we know that intellectually, but we read them as if they're the Jesus of history. The church councils, whether we accept them or reject them, the creeds, Renaissance humanism, all the various reformations in the 16th century, the scientific revolution, the American and French revolutions in terms of the democratization of intellectual thought, building upon the reformations of the 16th century. How have artistic and literary and theatrical images, cultural expressions shaped our views of who Jesus is? I could have included here William Blake, for example, and his images of heaven and hell. Our images of heaven and hell, are more shaped by Blake than they are of the Bible or of Christian tradition. Church and Sunday school experiences, your own personal reading and devotional life. And then finally, your own Myers-Briggs analysis or your own Enneagram, your own Enneagram diagnosis, your own psychological, emotional, educational temperaments. How has your whiteness, your socioeconomic class, how has that shaped your view of who Jesus is? Well, anyway, I wanted to just put it on the screen to let you think about these things because they've all been filters to how we interpret who the Jesus of history is, who we really don't know much about. Okay, and I sent you these liturgies, hymns, and creeds. So, the first Christians believed the world would come to an end in their lifetimes. When it didn't come to pass, they had to reorient themselves to what their following of Jesus meant. Not the end of history, but present throughout history. In fact, the fulfillment of history to which history itself points, what Pelican calls the turning point of history. So they begin to look into the past, to Jesus and the Hebrew Bible, and they look to the future, the second coming, delayed into an indefinite future. So now their whole understanding of time changes. They originally thought that time was coming to an end, history was coming to an end. Now, what happens when their sense of what time is, what history is, changes? That history has a goal, not only at the end of history, but in history itself. It's a major change that takes place for these early Jesus followers. So, I want to talk about two people today from the chapter to give you a little bit more of a perspective about how the sense of time changes. Eusebius of Caesarea was a Palestinian bishop, born, ordained, and consecrated bishop in Caesarea during a foundational time for the early church. Important events during his lifetime were the Great Persecution under Diocletian and his co-rulers in 303, the conversion of Emperor Constantine in 312, and the Council of Nicaea in 325. Just think about that. These momentous events happened during his time. By the way, the church history written by Paul Meyer, he used to teach here in Fort Wayne before he went to Western Michigan in Kalamazoo. He's a Missouri Synod Lutheran historian, but he's written the definitive history. He's written the definitive work on Eusebius and the translation of Eusebius's church history. We saw with our own eyes, Eusebius writes, the houses of prayer thrown down to the very foundations, the divine and sacred scriptures committed to flames in marketplaces, and the bishops, the shepherds of the churches, basely hidden here and there, and some of them captured ignominiously. He's living through this terribly transitional time in the history of the church. So he grows up in Caesarea in Palestine, was ordained under his teacher and friend Pamphilus. Sometimes he's called Eusebius Pamphilii. During Diocletian's great persecution, which I said begins in 303 and lasts for a decade, Pamphilus, his teacher, was martyred, and Eusebius was imprisoned. He was released after a few years by a new emperor, and after that he became bishop of Caesarea around 313, around the same time of Constantine's Edict of Milan, which established religious tolerance for Christianity. So he's imprisoned by Diocletian. He's released when around the same time as Constantine, instead of persecuting Christians, establishes this Edict of Milan, which presents a tolerance for the Christian faith. And he writes a 15-volume preparation, a refutation of paganism, the demonstration of the gospel, demonstrating Christ's fulfillment of the Old Testament, and his chronicle, his world history. He then undertakes his magnum opus, his 10-volume ecclesiastical history, his church history, which he began during the Roman persecutions and finished around 324. That's why he's known as the father of church history. He's a big deal. Think about it, though. Whether this is a positive or a negative, development for you. Think about this. There are no previous collection of documents, no books about any of the important figures, no chronologies of major events, not even a fixed system for dating. So then, given that, he writes, I pray that God may guide me and the power of the Lord assist me, for I have not found even the footprints of any predecessors on this path, only traces in which some have left various accounts of the times in which they lived. That's what he starts with when he begins to write his church history. There's a lot I could say about the church history. You have to read excerpts of this when you're in the seminary. But I'll mention these three. Sadly, and this is where we get some of this, Eusebius blames the troubles that befell the Jews on their role in the death of Jesus. So he perpetuates this myth that from the time seditions and wars and mischievous plots followed each other in quick succession and never ceased in the city and all Judea until finally the siege of Vespasian overwhelmed them, the divine vengeance overtook the Jews for the crimes which they dared commit against Christ. So this is a really sad legacy that he leaves Christians to follow, that the way that the Jews were Christ killers, And that's why they were prejudiced against for so much of church history. And by the way, this continues all the way up through National Socialism and Hitler. Hitler was a baptized Christian, you remember. And most of the Nazis and Gestapos were Christian, members of the Gestapo, and the church leaders. And they drew upon Eusebius's church history for their antagonism and prejudice against the Jews. Number 2, as part of his church history, he told stories of some of the saints. History as hagiography. That's the fancy term. Hagio graphy, hagiography. That is history written as holy stories about the saints. So this is his example of Procopius, the first Palestinian martyr, the first Palestinian saint. He's from Beit Shean. Those of you who have traveled with me to the Holy Land, we travel by bus down the Jordan Valley Highway through Beit Shean. Beit Shean is what it's called here. That's where Procopius was from. So he's pulled in front of the governor, and Flavianus says to him, "It's necessary that you should sacrifice to the gods. There's no God but one only." And then he goes on to say, "And when the judge felt himself smitten by the blow of the martyr's words, he furnished himself with the arms of another kind against the doctrine of truth, commanded him to sacrifice to the emperors. But Procopius laughed and said, 'The rule of many is not good. Let there be one ruler and one sovereign.'" He's quoting Homer. And with that, they struck off his head. But that only gave to him an easy transit along the way to heaven. History, though, as hagiography. Interesting. But remember, history was being invented, at least in the Christian world at this time, reinvented, right? History was being reinvented with a slant toward Christian history. His goal was to demonstrate, number 3, that with the conversion of Constantine, Christianity was the pinnacle of human history. And thus it could now lead to a period of world peace, the Pax Constantiana. So to do that, he writes the life of Constantine with stories the emperor related to him himself. This is one of the primary sources for the conversion of Constantine, in which he and his soldiers saw a cross-shaped trophy formed from light above the midday sun, in which he also saw the phrase spelled out in light, "En tuto Nike or in hoc signo vinces," by this sign conquer. This is a familiar story you all know, but right before the battle at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine, at least he relates, has this vision. And according to Eusebius, Christ appeared to him, identifying the signs belonging to him, and to mark his weapons and shields with the sign of the cross. So we have these stories because of Eusebius, and the rest, as they say, is history. By this sign conquer. And so he not only issues the Edict of Milan, which is religious tolerance of Christianity, but then makes Christianity the favored religion in Christianity, and calls the Council of Nicaea in 325, where he gathers the bishops to give a symbol of the Christian faith and draw the Church of the Holy Roman Empire together. That's 325. So that's Eusebius, the father of church history. The next person, the last person I want to talk about today, is Dionysius exiguous. At the end of the chapter, very briefly, Pelikan tells us about the 5th and 6th century Russian monk Dionysius the Humble, Denis the Humble, Denis the Short, exiguous, who created a system that led to the modern Gregorian calendar, which in turn led to the designation BC and AD, and whose system for dating is still used today to determine the date of Easter. He was invited to Rome by the Pope and was asked by Pope John I to set out the dates for Easter from the years 527 to 626. He was especially well positioned for this task as he was both fluent in Greek and Latin. He was also a mathematician and an astronomer. And so he was able, like I say, he was well positioned to be able to calculate these dates. So I'm going to read this kind of slow. I'm going to read my presentation kind of slowly here because it gets to be kind of in the weeds, but it's important to know. So figuring the date of Easter, it was much in contention during this time between the Eastern and Western churches. Remember, they were arguing over sacred time. They were arguing over what it meant that time itself was sacred. So one, in the East, the Alexandrian rule had been created by the Council of Nicaea in 325. The other, that was used by the church in Rome, declared that Easter must fall between March 25th and April 21st, and relied on an 84-year cycle. They disagreed with each other is the basic point between East and West, between Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. So the East and the West disagreed. So as I say, Dionysius used his training in Greek and Latin and as a scientist, mathematician, and astronomer to calculate the dates. He decided with the East, with Nicaea, and he further elaborated on it with references to the heavens. The beginning of this is what he writes. The beginning of the first lunar month, Nisan, from 8th March to 5 April inclusive. The lunar limits 15 to 21 for Easter Sunday. The theory of the spring equinox on 21 March as the earliest possible date for the spring or the 14th moon. The calendar limits for the Paschal full moon and those for the festival Easter itself. Now see how clear that was? This is what he meant. Easter will fall on the first Sunday following the 14th day of the lunar cycle, the full moon, that falls on or after the spring equinox. By the way, that's what we use today in the West. I'll say it again. Easter falls on the first Sunday following the 14th day of the full moon that falls on or after the spring equinox. And like I say, the Roman Church, the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian Church, the United Church, all the churches in the West follow that today. Dionysius Exiguus's measuring of Easter. And from there, he goes further. From there, then, he chose the year in which Rome had been founded. By the way, we're going to find that this is 753 BCE, but not now. He chose the year that Rome had been founded and determined that Jesus had been born 753 years later. Okay? Everybody was, the Julian calendar, everybody was dating things from the founding of Rome. Like now we date things from the birth of Jesus. Those days in the Roman Empire, the founding of Rome was year 0. So he then went and said, okay, Jesus was born 753 years later. Julius Caesar established the Julian calendar on January 1st, 45 BC. He figured all this based upon the movement of the sun, and then he replaced the original Roman lunar calendar. So he takes the original Roman calendar based on the movements of the moon and changes it to base it on a solar calendar. And he sets March 25th as the spring equinox. By the way, we follow, right, the Gregorian calendar. Pope Gregory established it in 1582, and that made some minor corrections in the Julian calendar. The Julian calendar was pretty close to what we have today, but it had some minor errors because it didn't account for leap days. Anyway, that's beside the point. The Julian calendar, though, is based on the movement of the sun, not based on the previous Roman lunar calendar. By the way, in the Muslim world, the Arab world, in the Jewish world, they still, although they have to follow the solar calendar because the world has moved on, but in their religious reckoning and their religious rituals, they still follow the lunar calendar. The Julian calendar had numbered years from Rome's founding, but Dionysius had a different idea, numbering the years from the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ, in order that the beginning of our hope should be better known to us, and the cause of our recovery, that is, the passion of our Redeemer, should shine forth more clearly. So this is when he proposed BC, before Christ, and Anno Domini, AD, in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. So AD, as you know, doesn't mean after the death of Jesus. It means Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. So he creates the Christian era calendar that we follow today. So how did he figure the date of Jesus' birth? I'm glad you asked. He knew that there was already a popular belief that God created the earth on March 25th. This had already been for 300 to 400 years with Hippolytus in around the year 200. By the way, fiat luminarium fermento cele dixit. It just is a quote from Genesis 1, right? Let there be, fiat means let there be. He said, dixit, let there be light in the firmament of the heavens, cele, firmament. He said, let there be light in the firmament of the heavens. So this is the creation of the world, and the popular belief since the year 200 in Christian circles was that God created the world on March the 25th. Also, since Jesus was the Son of God, which meant that he was perfect, well, that means that Jesus must have been conceived, incarnated on March the 25th. That makes sense, right? As a scientist, as a Christian who was a scientist, which means that he must have been born 9 months later on December the 25th. Well, that was pretty smooth. That was pretty slick because that was already an auspicious choice, because 300 years previously in 274 in Rome, the Emperor Aurelian had already declared December 25th a civic holiday in celebration of the birth of Mithras, the sun god. And 60 years later, in 336 in Rome, Christians countered the emperor by celebrating the birth of Jesus, the Son of God, on December 25th. So this worked out real nicely for Dionysius Exiguus. And Christians in Antioch, now in the West, celebrated the birth of Jesus on January the 6th. And Christians in Alexandria didn't begin to celebrate Christmas at all until 430. So what Dionysius does is he standardizes, he formalizes for the entire Christian church, he standardizes the birth of Jesus on December the 25th. The differences still today are the Greek Orthodox Church, which still celebrated on January the 6th. If you go to Bethlehem today, and Terry and some of you know this already, Latin Christians celebrate the birth of Jesus on December 25th. The Orthodox churches celebrated on January the 6th, which we call Epiphany, and the Armenian churches celebrated at the end of January sometime. So Bethlehem has 3 celebrations of Christmas. Also, since Jesus lived a perfect life, he must have been crucified too on March the 25th. So you catch the dating here. So until Dionysius came along, there were disagreements between the East and West about dating the birth of Jesus, or whether they even wanted to celebrate the birth of Jesus at all. He blends all these traditions together and he puts Christmas on the map. Jesus was born, he declared, on December 25th in the Roman year 753, dating it from the founding of Rome. He then suspended time for a few days and declared January the 1st, 754, New Year's Day in Rome, and redated it. He then went even further and he redated it as 1 AD because Roman numbering had no way to designate 0. So that's how we get the redating of the Roman calendar through the Julian calendar to the Dionysian calendar, and he takes it and makes 1 AD the center of history. His one mistake, of course, is that Matthew says Jesus was born during the reign of Herod, who died then, according to this new calendar, in 4 BCE. Well, oh well. All right, that was a whole lot, but you can see the machinations that took place. But he was central. He was central in bringing about the dating of the Christian era and changing the calendar that we still live with today. Finally, and Pelican just makes a passing reference in the chapter. But finally, these computations were sealed for the English-speaking world in the 8th century with the English Benedictine monk and father of English history, the Venerable Bede. It's because of his a church history of the English people, or an ecclesiastical history of the English people, written in 731. That covers the years 55 BC to 731 in our era, AD, Common Era. So about 786 years history. It's from this book that we know about the early centuries of Christianity in Britain, especially the history of Celtic Christianity. Those of you who are interested in the early years of Celtic Christianity and how it was born, it's from Bede, who we know about it. In his history, he also included the history of the world from Eusebius. And in his earlier works, On Time and the Reckoning of Time, he praised the work of Dionysius Exiguus and adopted his use of BC AD for dating history, thereby sealing it in Europe and throughout the West. So I wanted to give a little bit more detail to Pelikan's thesis that now Jesus becomes the turning point of history, literally in the Christian West and East. Well, there you go. Where would you like to jump in?
Michael, just a little side note. I'd like to make a correction on your wood carvings. Early on was Four Horsemen of Apocalypse. That's actually the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame, I think.
Ah, yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. You know their names?
Well, there's Layden and Stuletter and a couple others. I'm not sure. Grant was right. So.
Rodney.
Thanks. Yep. Thanks, Quentin.
Yeah.
This idea, you know, it's easy to be cynical about all this, but you know, think about this. These people, these early Christians are undergoing great turmoil, right? Great tribulations. And they're finding, as we're going to see next week, and the Christian faith, the world as they know it is coming to an end, even though the world isn't coming to an end. And somehow they're so captured by the stories, their experiences and stories of this carpenter, this peasant carpenter from Galilee, that they reorient their entire view of time and history so that they see Christ everywhere. They see him in their Hebrew Bibles as they look to the past. And next week, we're going to see how they see him as they look into the past, as the faith gets spread throughout the Mediterranean world. They're going to see him even in Greek and Roman literature. Their whole worldview changes. Even their sense of time changes. And now they see Christ, Jesus, as the fulcrum point by which they even measure time itself. I find this chapter really fascinating. It begs the question, doesn't it, in our individual lives, whether you're Christian or not, in your individual lives, what's the fulcrum point through which you measure time? But that's another story. Anyway, I'll stop here. Where would you like to jump in?
I had an interesting conversation when Frank and I went to Lutheran to get our first COVID shot. An elderly lady checked us in. She was even older than I am, 90 if she's a day. And don't ask me how we got to have this strange conversation. She made a remark to me about, you know, we're living in the end times. And I almost replied to her just like Paul thought he was living, you know, that this was it. But I thought, no, Judy, just be kind. But so the time reference for today, we see time differently than obviously this lady, like, and we might be living in the end times, but somehow I don't think, I think that's just, I thought it was an interesting comment coming from her. You know, we're living in the end times, and I didn't say anything.
You know, if you think about, thank you for that, Judy. You know, if you think about it, there are a number of ways to think about how time times us. If we believe that the world was coming to an end in the next month, year, in our lifetimes, or if our end was coming, it would change the way we lived. Number one, which is what the early Christians thought. Number two, if you think you're going to live forever, or at least to the end of your days, that's also a different way of understanding time. But Here, that's right. So they're thinking about time itself. In the West, they're thinking of time as linear. Linear. Has a start, has a middle, has a fulfillment, has a history. At least that's the shift that takes place now for these early Christians. I'm also thinking, though, about a different view of time, and that's in the East. What about if time isn't linear? What if time is circular? You know, that's the difference between a resurrection understanding of time and a reincarnation understanding of time, right? So our Hindu, Buddhist, and other friends from our Eastern faiths, they would have a whole different understanding of history and time. That's sort of a tangent for what we're talking about today. But this idea of how time, how underlying a lot of the way we view life, right? And how we view meaning, underlying all that is a philosophical presupposition of how we view time. And that's what Pelican's getting to, at least suggesting we think about in this chapter. Thanks, Judy. The fulfillment of history, and yet the turning point in the middle of history, so that everything speaks of Jesus now for these people.
I found it interesting that even though that they're trying to construct and finitize time and everything, that I had never heard that the Earth began on March 25th, and it's interesting that that would be the birth of Jesus, but they still kind of keep, because like in my mind, I think of for time back then for them was more about watching for the seasons, because that had a lot to do with whether you lived or died back then, being prepared, harvesting and reaping and sowing and doing all of that stuff at its proper time. And I kind of think it's really interesting that everything is March 25th, which is very, very close. And I'm wondering if at the time everybody decided on March 25th that, where the spring equinox was.
It's exactly it.
In all of this.
The spring equinox was declared as March the 25th, Tony. So right. In some ways it's not surprising, isn't it?
No.
It's not surprising.
That the beginning of everything would kind of be, and it really surprises me in knowing these facts that our calendars and everything don't really start at March 25th. To me, that's the surprising element, that the new year and everything wouldn't start around March 25th as kind of this birthing kind of thing. That really, putting my head kind of back in where they were and what they were thinking and how they were trying to create things. It's kind of amazing to me that January 5th is what they landed on, or January 1st is what they landed on, and that we don't start everything with the spring equinox. It's fascinating.
The Persian calendar does. The Persian.
Just what I was going to say, Terry.
It predates a Christian calendar, and it's based on the solar cycles. Actually, by our calendar, March 21st, which is the spring equinox, and so yeah, and they still celebrate it to this day.
If you think about it, time, this thing we call time, how we measure it, there's something symbolic about how we measure time, right? So, for example, in the Christian calendar, again, how you measure the 40 days of Lent, right? You all know this. Sundays aren't part of those 40 days of Lent, are they? If you measure from Ash Wednesday to Easter, the Sundays aren't part of the 40 days. In fact, you end up with 47 or 48 days if you count the Sundays. Why? Because every Sunday is Easter. Every Sunday is considered Easter, the day of the sun, right? The day of the new birth, the day of new life, the day of the rising of the sun in the east, the day of new birth. So the way we even measure time has a sort of symbolic character to it. And I'm imagining that there are ways that happens not only in the religious world, but also just in our everyday lives. So the measuring of time, that this chapter gets to the heart of it. And the writing of history too, of course, we're still writing histories. History is hagiography. And this happened, by the way, in the Hebrew Bible. King David has all these court historians, and that's what we have a lot of in the Old Testament. The emperor, Eusebius might as well have been, right, the court historian for Constantine. His life of Constantine, my God, have you ever read? I mean, you have to read this stuff in the seminary, but his life of Constantine, my God, it's a panegyric, for Constantine. And likewise, these hagiographies of the early saints, Procopius, like we read, the first Palestinian saint. But these were considered histories in those days. And even a guy like John Meacham, I haven't read it, but when he talks so glowingly about John Lewis in his latest book, or others, there's a certain slant, right? There's a certain slant to these iconic figures who we hold up as our heroes. Yeah. Rather than John Lewis as one of the African American, right, pillars of neoliberal capitalism. Doesn't mean he shouldn't be celebrated as an icon of the civil rights movement, but there's more to him that meets the eye. I digress. Matt?
So I want to pick up on your contrast with John Lewis, because I continue to look at your initial slide where you had the Jesus of history at the bottom, and then Michael Spath and Matt Sprunger's and everybody else's understanding of Jesus at the top.
You want me to call that back up, Matt, or not? May I do that?
To me, I think that's one of the most powerful, maybe most helpful or most damning, whatever, for my own journey is, I had to struggle last week when you said that Jesus really was convinced that it was the apocalypse, and all the writers we have going back to, by the time you get to Eusebius and Constantine, who takes what my understanding of the historical Jesus is and turns him into an empire builder and justifier for state violence, state unity, but also state violence. So that oral tradition, and then Paul writing actually before Mark, and my understanding, and I need to be corrected if I'm wrong, but Paul basically was writing a theology of salvation, and my understanding of at least Mark was a very different purpose and a very different understanding, and then how we up at the very top filter all those things that happen in between, and still trying to get back to of what little we know, what each one of us understands about the Jesus of history and what his intentionality is. Because if I remember correctly, the book started the first chapter that Jesus, the author believes that Jesus saw himself as a rabbi, but also a rabbi who was more than a rabbi. And I think that how much of that, more than a rabbi, is still the crux of the matter. So I think that slide right there is incredibly powerful. And I'm not quite sure what to do with it, but I'd love to know more about the oral tradition that then gets to Paul and then the Gospels, and then getting to the creeds by 300. Because my take is that historical Jesus had nothing to do with what became Christianity that we all have grown up with, been imbued with, and it's that struggle I have, being heavily influenced by my indoctrination, and I said this Apostles' Creed every other week in the Statement of Faith in the United Church of Christ, the opposite weeks as a kid every Sunday, and it took me a long time to see where that came into being. So it's confessional, but it's also asking questions of knowing more about what happened from 29 Common Era until Paul, until then the Gospels, and then especially until Constantine.
Thank you for that, Matt. I will just, I want to hear what others have to say about this particular screen. This isn't found anywhere. I didn't copy this. This is Michael Spath here, and there are other things I could have included or should have included. I didn't include Darwin. I could have included Darwin. There are other things. I wanted to include William Blake, just because of his artwork of Heaven and Hell. It's in there, but very generally, there's so much else I could have included. But I just sat down at my computer and I thought, what are the various filters? As I'm sitting here at my computer, what are the filters through which the people who are in the class might have either positive or negative or neutral understanding of who Jesus is? And again, we think of the Jesus of history as the one that we read about in the Bible. And yet you can see, right, that even that is a filter, because the Jesus in Mark is different than the one in Matthew, as you know, is different than the one in Luke, and different than the one in John, who's different than the one in Paul. So which one of those Jesuses really, even those are different from each other, right? And the early Paul is different than the late Paul, etc. So you have all these different Jesuses in the Bible, but in our education in the Christian church, they all get amalgamated into Jesus. And when really, again, we come back, he comes to us as one unknown. So who is the Jesus that either we've come to reject, those of us on the call who maybe don't see him as the guide for our life, or those of us who do see Jesus as the guide for our life? I tried to figure out even how to title your Jesus at the top of the page. And I ended up with just something very simple, because it really is, in the end, not Jesus, but each one of our own Jesuses. You know what I mean? So that's the point that I was trying to make. So, man, I appreciate your comments very much.
On that, probably the biggest single influencer on my changed filter about Jesus was my visit to Qumran, and I became fascinated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this was in my first trip back in '98. We went there, and when I came home, I spent several years reading about the Dead Sea Scrolls and learning about the community and learning about the relationship of Jesus and John the Baptist, for instance, and then learning about the Nag Hammadi Gnostic writings that were discovered in Egypt. And the more I read, the more convinced I became that there had been a book burning, a scroll burning, a scroll destruction, and the community at Qumran and the Nag Hammadi monks, monasteries, hid their writings away so that they would not be destroyed. So just as Hitler had book burnings, those were going on, especially I think after the destruction of Rome in 72 AD, but even before. What was it that drove out the community that lived at Qumran? And Jesus and his relationship with his cousin John the Baptist, I think, is very informative as to who Jesus was and believed he was. And you find him, expressed that way in both the canon, those books that have been carried on through the ages, and the Gnostic writings that were destroyed. So he was a much more human, I think, being than what has come down to us through the Gospels.
Thank you for that, Terry. You bring up you brought up a number of very important points. I'll just raise one because I want other people to talk. But the relationship between Jesus and John the Baptizer is really a very fascinating study. I tend to believe he was a disciple of John's, not his cousin, but a disciple, although the New Testament suggests that they were related by cousins, but Elizabeth, Mary's kinswoman. But, I think that's a later addition. But anyway, that's interesting, that relationship between John the Baptizer and Jesus. Thanks for that, Terry. That was really important. Who else?
I have a comment. If no one else has their hand up earlier, I can't figure out where to put my hand up on this.
That's okay. Go ahead, Patty.
Okay, this is a wonderful thing right here. I tried to print it, but my computer won't let me print it. But anyway, one other filter, an additional filter, is all the translations everything has been through the years, through the centuries, through the millennia, because those are all filters. They make a difference on the competence and the knowledge of the translator and the integrity of the translator. I have sometimes, in reading things from two different languages, discovered, oh, they pulled a fast one right there, changing information, distorting things. I mean, not a lot, because I only read one other language well, but I've caught this sometimes in other translations when I looked up words. Anyway, so language is a big filter.
Boy, Patty, that's a major omission here. I mean, thank you for that. Absolutely. The translations are an important filter. Who else?
Michael,
Uh-huh.
is there any written history other than what we read in the scriptures about John the Baptist?
He's written about in Josephus, and he's referred to in the Qumran chronicles that there was a guy named John who came, and most scholars believe that refers to John the Baptizer. He stayed there right up until he was going to take what we would call final vows. He was sort of a novice, stayed with the community. What was it now? Maybe 7 years. And right before he was ready to become a full-fledged member of the community, he took off. So there's some reference to him in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't remember which one.
Remind us of Josephus, exactly the time frame and who he was writing for.
Yeah, the 1st century, he was writing for the emperor.
Was it not Herod the Great, but Herod's son? So it was very early history, almost concurrent with the apostles, I believe.
Absolutely, Terry.
Michael, could you send us copies of this?
Whoops. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, because I don't think we got your presentation from last week either. You did send us.
I thought I sent that out to everybody. I didn't?
Maybe you did, and I just need to look. But I really, this particular slide, I loved Patty's comment about language and everything, because the whole thing is predicated on an oral tradition, which to me lends credence to not believing in a literal Bible, and that my Jesus is a lot like my Bible, and all of this is kind of very individualized, and it really, for me, I think it kind of opens that door that, I need to not necessarily change my opinion, but at least look at others' opinions more openly. And yes, I use all of these things, and my Jesus has changed a lot through my journey and everything. And that maybe I need to look at other people's journey a little more open, and take the, I take the Bible, definitely not literally, but evolutionary, in that it changes for me all the time. It's to me, it's almost like a living document that changes on my own personal filters and stuff like that. And that, I don't know where I'm trying to go with this. I got lost. It just made me think of, how lucky I am that I have had the particular filters that have led me down my path. But what are those filters and things that have led people down a different path?
Thank you, Tony, for that. Let me try this one out for size for you. In our country, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence hold a special place of honor for us. They have a certain authority in our civic and political life. Yet we know that when they were written, right, they privileged white, landowning, slave-owning men. And so we've had to believe over the years, right, that they were living documents, and that even though they hold a place of honor, they needed to be corrected. So you have the various amendments. But even now, Supreme Court decisions, right? A woman's right to choose, for example, which those of us on the call, most of us would uphold very firmly. Well, that isn't stated specifically, right, in any of our founding documents. It was read into as a natural outgrowth, right? If the founders would have been taught, if the people who wrote these documents would have been thinking about it, or this is the natural outcome, right, of what they would have meant. Same with the women's right to vote, or African Americans' right to vote, for that matter, right? In other words, Tony, I liked what you had to say about these being living documents. The United Church of Christ, one of its mottos is, "The Spirit is still speaking." And on the one hand, that can be very dangerous, because what we think is a spirit might be our own opinion. So we always have to check ourselves, right? On the other hand, it's a statement of faith. And that's what this comes down to, right? This isn't, on the one hand, we're doing this as scholars from the outside looking in. But as scholars looking at it from the outside in, we have to enter into the mindset of these early first and second century Christians who were fervent believers, who had this fervent faith. And so, as I said last time, Mark and Matthew and Luke and John and Paul, and even the early church fathers in these councils, they believed that the Spirit was still the Spirit of Jesus, not some just general spirit, but the Spirit of Jesus was still alive, and that they somehow themselves were inspirited, inspired to speak definitively. So they had no problems at all putting words into Jesus' mouth, that if he would have been thinking about it, this is certainly what he would have said, because the very spirit of Jesus was speaking to them. So for them, the spirit was still alive. Now, as scholars looking back at that now, we can say, well, there's a danger in that, isn't there? But even the early church had checks and balances on themselves, because there were certain views that weren't accepted, and there were certain books that weren't accepted into the canon. The last thing I'll say, for evidence for this, there was a time in my life when I read a number of the resolutions and the proceedings from the early church councils. Like I say, you do that in the seminary. And it was nothing for the fathers who were gathered at the Council of Nicaea or Constantinople. When they promulgated some doctrinal resolution, they would say, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. And then they would say whatever it is that they were going to say. They really believed that the Spirit of Jesus was still speaking through them. I'll leave it alone at that. I went on and on there. Sorry about that, gang. Go ahead. Who wants to jump in?
One question, Michael. The term atonement didn't come up, and I'm assuming it didn't exist in first century, even third century, because that's a lot of the understanding of many followers today. And so when that fervor was there, what was holding them to something beyond?
The short answer is, if you take a look at the early Christian iconography, it wasn't the blood atonement so much as a return to paradise. You have all these pictures of Jesus. In fact, I should do that maybe for next time. Or maybe I'll send you maybe a little PowerPoint or something that I worked up. But if you take a look at you got to be careful, because the websites, some of them are wrong if you type in earliest images of Jesus. But if you take a look at the earliest 5 or 6 images of Jesus, there are a couple that are written by people who hated Christians and persecuted them. One with Jesus on a cross with a mule's head. But the other ones, the more positive images, are Jesus as a shepherd, Jesus in a new paradise, in a new garden, reestablishing the first order of things. It's kind of the plushness of life, the abundant life. And it's only, with the persecutions, like we're going to look at next time, where you get in the second, third, and fourth centuries, the persecutions, where this idea of martyrdom comes in. And so Jesus, we're going to talk about next week, Jesus as victor, comes in. And then especially in the medieval period, the various apocalyptic views with the blood atonement. But the cross is really a later Christian image. It's not one of the first images. It's the plushness of the resurrected life.
Do you think all of that resurrection comes? I mean, for me, it kind of seems like if their whole society, because they have back then a shorter livelihood, and they're always living in the fear of the end times, which apparently a lot of people still do. Are they trying to justify their own life and or just make sure that they're covered when they're gone, when they pass? Or do you know what I'm trying to say?
That comes in a little later, Tony, really. I mean, the idea that history now is elongated, right? That the end of the world is not coming, right? That the end of the world is not coming. And now they're going to live out their lives. And in fact, now history is going to continue indefinitely. How does that change? They got to change their faith.
Well,
Because
but
the
it
whole
is,
understanding of
is
time changes.
right, but is the resurrection part, isn't that part right at the beginning, and the promise of heaven and the promise of something better when you pass this world, when you know, shake this mortal coal, whatever you call it, that is all of that kind of imagery coming from the fact that they have a short life, they're kind of it almost sounds like they're kind of obsessed with the end of times. Um,
Well, that's the point. It's not the way we think of it, I guess is what I want to say. The obsession with the end times is no more. That's the point. They're going to live now. They're going to live out their days. And the end of the world is projected now into an indefinite future. And the kind of baggage that we have in the West, I don't mean you on the screen, each one of you have figured out the death thing or are figuring it out, but the kind of baggage in the West that, you know, the the weight of hell and death is the enemy, and you know, all that kind of thing. It's kind of in these early days of Christianity, Easter becomes this transitionary. It's a transitionary event. One's death is. One gets translated into a garden of paradise again. It's not for a number of other. It's not for a while longer. At least another couple of 100 years that you find this real weight of the anxiety and fear of death that comes the way it is that we know of it today. It's not to say that people weren't afraid of dying and all the rest on a psychological, emotional level, but it didn't have that theological weight to it that we have learned in the West. That comes a little later. Who else?
Does make me think about how all the hoopla around 2000 affected us and affected our religious outlook, and just suddenly even how that changed our lives, whether we believed it or not. I think it probably had an impact, much like you're talking about.
Absolutely, Lee. Absolutely. And you know, I appreciate it. Thank you for that. I appreciated what Linda Kerr shared last time, you know, or on Sunday when I was talking about Buddhism. Those of you who were there, about holding on and letting go. We were talking about the second and third noble truths of the Buddha. Those of you who were there might remember the conversation. And she said, you know what I find myself holding on to the most right now is my need for more time.
Mhm, mhm.
This idea that we are timed beings and what that means. I guess if nothing else today, you know, whether, you know, however you think of this early Christian movement and how they dealt with it, how we think of ourselves as being timed, you know, and what that does to us, and how we think of not only our time, but time itself. Are we part of an ongoing stream of time before we were conceived and after we pass, right? As some do, or are we timed and that's it? And what happens? What does that do to how we live and our sense of ethics, our sense of an ethic? What does that all mean for us that we live in time? Time is an elusive concept to grasp, but we know that we're timed. And so the whole idea of the philosophy of time and history is a complex one. It's complex philosophically, it's complex theologically, but it's also complex psychologically. Anybody?
And scientifically, if I might add,
Absolutely.
the anthropopic principle I was thinking of here, but that's a whole nother story. But
Please, Quentin, no, share a little bit about that.
well, looking at your chart, I was trying to find a path for finding my Jesus, and I couldn't find a hook too many places, but it started with my readings, I guess, would be one, and the other one was the Copernican science revolution, and the anthropopic principle is kind of a counter, or it became more inclusive of Copernicus, because Copernicus looked at science without essentially without man being part of it. But as anthropopic says, man is included in it, and but it obviously it precludes the divinity of Jesus for me, for many reasons. But just to get back to the principle, it's this continuum of energy to matter to life to intellect, and it is the universe cosmologically looking at it as it's created its own understanding of itself, if that doesn't get too far away. And we talk about time, but I think we've telescoped time down to what we can grasp, as humans, and we put the rest to something divine. But time is defined scientifically. It's a singularity. I know we've talked about this before, and like space is a singularity. And our existence, in my view, is when I came from non-existence, and I'll go back to the same non-existence that I had before I was born. And that, I think, is we talk about not having enough time and what to do with our time. I think that's a greater incentive to make use of our time than allowing or going to some kind of divine definition of where we are and what we're coming from, and having a life, everlasting life. I think that's an invitation not to make perfect use of time. But I think I just started rambling here a little bit. But I think the scientific part of it was part of it for me, that part of my readings. And it just, and I understand Jesus in that context, and not that he didn't exist by any means, but I can see myriad thinkers that say the same thing that Christ did, and sometimes and many times more eloquently and more in context, especially context of their time. Trying to fit all of this into this Palestinian rebel, is I think it makes it very short-sighted and very narrow. I mean, we have thinkers now that expand upon this. We saw it at the inauguration, for heaven's sakes, with Amanda Gorman. I mean, it's that type of thing. So that's my take on it, and I'm sure this sounds pretty bizarre to most people here, but
well, no, not at all, Patty. I'm going to get to you in just a second, but let me just simply say, I saw what I know of you. I saw a direct path through almost every one of those stages to what you believe about Jesus, and that is, raised in the Catholic Church, you traversed each one of those stages, many of which now you've rejected. But they helped form a certain opinion that you ended up rejecting. Had you taken a different route, you may have seen, and I'm just guessing here, but had you taken a different route in your life, who knows? You may have seen more of a confluence between Copernicus and Galileo and humanism and all the rest, with a particular perspective on Jesus, than the path that you traversed in your life. Who knows? But your particular path through the Catholic Church's understanding of the creeds and all the rest, right, led you to a certain rejection of those particular views. But you still traversed that path, right?
And this Catholic concept was not all gospel. It's gospel and tradition, and I think that might have been an early door that opened for me a little bit there, you know, and I don't know, but I appreciate what you're saying there, you know, my
No,
path.
for sure. And that now you've landed at a place where what'd you call him, a rebel Palestinian? So you have a certain conception of who he is. Now, this wasn't a chart that charted our path to our own spiritual heroes, because that's not the purpose of the class, about, you know, developing one's own religious tradition. But that would be an interesting one in and of itself, wouldn't it? What's the chart, what's our chart look like? And who are on the tops of each one of our spiritual mountains? You know, that are mountains of ultimacy, let's call them peaks of ultimacy. That would be an interesting one in and of itself. But because this is a course on the Jesus through the centuries, that's why I focused on the Jesus of history and your Jesus. I think you added a real important addition, Quentin. So thank you. Patty, go ahead, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Okay. And a lot of, you know, our sense of time, both the idea of calendar time, as you have just shown us in this class, that calendar time is something that is very changeable. You know, it can change by who the emperor is and what they decide we're going to live by. And even clock time is something that if you lived 2,000 years ago, probably your best sources of clock time were observing the sun, sundials, and hourglasses. And that was about as, you know, how they worked is about as precise as you could get on clock time. And a lot of people didn't pay attention to the hourglass all the time. They just lived by what the sun was doing outside. And also, that's just for our conscious mind. Often we spend in our unconscious, like when you're dreaming, your concept of time is drastically different. And you, present and past kind of blend together. And you, in conscious life, we are all sometimes, you know, the older we get, the more this is true, are aware of our own mortality. But in a dream, you're not so aware of your own mortality. In fact, you might be talking to people who have passed on and not think anything about it. And one other thing is that if in a dream, if you try to look at a clock or a calendar, you don't see them. You get a face on the clock, or you get some other kind of picture on the calendar. It's very, very rare that even to look at a digital clock. At a digital clock, that even gets jumbled. And people who work on lucid dreaming and how to know if they're dreaming or not dreaming are taught to practice every day. Look at a clock, look at a calendar. If it doesn't look the way you expect it to, you're probably dreaming.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. Yeah, Heidi, go ahead.
I have a quick comment about what Quentin was talking about. And I had a similar path as far as being raised in the Catholic Church and kind of traversing through my faith journey as I went. But I look at just sitting here questioning, you know, and talking about historical Jesus and why did he take hold? Why is Jesus the one that took hold, right? And my husband and I are total polar opposites in personality. And I think that's with your chart, Michael, about, you know, your different personalities also play a role, because I'm of the personality that I'm going to question. I'm going to seek more information. And my husband is quite fine with just what he grew up with. And so I think that definitely, the personality piece definitely plays a part of that path.
Thanks for that, Heidi. And well, Ron's here and some of the rest of you are here. You know, the Enneagram used to be Myers-Briggs, but now the Enneagram helps to kind of, you know, just discover one's particular personality type and how that colors, right? How that colors the kind of Jesus, even for the faithful, right? The kind of Jesus that speaks to him or her. As you can see, this book, if we're looking for the Jesus of history as faith, you know, and kind of like a devotional class, like a Bible class, we're not really discussing that so much, right? It really is about Jesus' place in culture and how he impacts the culture of the time. And in the first centuries, particularly the first and second centuries, uh, um, uh, this whole idea of time takes center focus because of the shift that takes place. So we'll be getting into other periods of history down the road. Anybody else with any final comments? Ron?
Just a quick question. Does this book cover any, I was strolling through the chapters. Does this discuss any ideas of what the scholars think that who Jesus himself thought he was?
That would have been last chapter, and any kind of conversation that we would have had. Pelican really is firmly in the camp, right, that he saw himself implanted in the Jewish tradition as a teacher, and so that's what last chapter would have been about, Ron. And really, what I tried to point out last discussion with the various 25 views, those weren't just what early Christians thought of Jesus. That's what those scholars last time actually believed Jesus was, or Jesus saw himself as. So those different views weren't just what, like I say, what the early Christians believed him to be. They actually saw those, each one of those scholars believed that was the Jesus of history. That's who he thought he was. So that would have been what we talked about last time. Yep. A peasant rebel, huh, Quentin? A Palestinian rebel. I like that. All righty. Hey, gang. Thanks for being with us today. And we'll see you with chapter 3 next time, the King of Kings. I'm really looking forward to next time. I've got the lecture and the PowerPoint already created. And so it'll be a good week to spend together. Thanks, everyone.